Leave a comment where you are listening in the world. Please subscribe if you enjoy our content. Enjoy! It is 3 days later, and I am still letting out deep sighs and Finn from Adventure Time high-pitched shrieks to try to get this experience out of my head. I just downloaded Tinder after a stressful semester, and I exchange a max of 20 messages with this guy. We agreed to meet up at his address, so I just assumed that we were going to hook up. I didn't bother being explicit about what I wanted. And aside, I should also mention for context that I have a really bad tendency of putting love interests, whether it's people I meet on a dating app for a few dates or a long-term relationship, on pedestals, which is complementary to my low self-esteem/low self-worth. I also used to identify as a lesbian, which I don't anymore. The first Tinder hookup experience I had was a year ago with a guy who started kissing me as soon as I took my jacket off at his apartment. No small talk or anything. So I kinda just assumed that's what all Tinder hookups were like. We both know what we were there for, so no point in small talk. Oops, mistake number 1. After that one time, I got a girlfriend, and we have since broken up, so I was never really able to explore any farther. Back to present. I get to his apartment, and it's a really cool space. He had told me about himself over text. He plays an instrument, teaches that instrument to kids as a job, works at a museum with kids as another job, is a consultant. His band just finished recording an album the other day, all while being a grad student at a university that's really hard to get into. And his apartment just told me that, yeah, this is his life. The kind of life I've wanted since childhood, but have since given up on because that kind of life only exists in books, right? I kind of had an inkling that being with him in any sort of sense would bring up those old tendencies again. But I wasn't planning on dating him, and he was really hot and seemed interested in me over text. And damn it, I deserved to let off some steam after a stressful semester. Once I get there, though, I am totally in awe, and I start getting nervous and intimidated and making way too much small talk and asking him about his life. Mistake number 2, I don't seem interested in just fucking, which I am. And then this is the moment that I keep replaying in my head over and over that makes me yelp. Right in the middle of small talk, I word vomited, and I quote, "I have to say this or I'm going to be super self-conscious the entire time, but I'm only used to being with women." No context, no preface, no nothing. Mistake number 3. He paused for a bit before saying, "We don't have to do anything." Fuck, oh fuck, why did I say that? Fuck, he's obviously not the type of guy who'd just ambush you with kissing right when you get there. He seems like he respects boundaries. Am I supposed to expect Tinder guys to be courteous when we both know we're just gonna fuck? Did he bring me over so he could get to know me? Are we not fucking? What is going on? Anyway, I either blacked out what hand-wavy thing I said right after that, or I just really said nothing at all to assure him that no, I did want to do stuff. But I was too awkward to know what to say to smooth that over. So I make my way over to his couch, because I'm sat at the floor playing with his pets at this point, and he offers to get me water, or to get me drunk, or to get me high. All options which under normal circumstances I would have considered taking him up on. But I knew it wouldn't be a good idea to get high or drunk when I was so anxious. Mistake number 4. We had to find something else to do, which was playing a video game. The way his apartment was set up was that we had to sit on 2 separate chairs that faced the screen. No space for physical contact or anything to make a move, basically. We ended up playing Pikmin 2 for 3 hours before I realized that, oh, I'm the one who's supposed to transition us out of this state. He probably doesn't know what to do since I made that awkward comment. So I said something and we ended up starting a movie, while I'm still sat at his chair. He starts pulling out blankets and pillowcases for his bed. It's a studio, so his bed was pretty much right next to his chair, and he laid on his bed facing the screen while I'm still on his chair. My first instinct was to think, okay, he's trying to make a move definitely, but then my brain went OF. He said he has work tomorrow morning, and we legit just played a video game for 3 hours. It's starting to get pretty late. I've overstayed my welcome, and plus I was so awkward. Oh my god, he's trying to tell me to leave so he can go to bed and sleep, but he's too polite to just tell me to leave his apartment, so I go. Oh my god, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize that it was so late. If you need to go to bed for work tomorrow, just let me know. Gave him an easy out, but totally forgot to give him an easy in. He kind of considers me for a moment and asks me if I had a curfew. I go no. Then more beats pass and he goes, yeah, I guess I should go to bed soon. And I go, yeah, I guess I'll walk home. Proceed to put my shoes on in awkward silence, hesitate before hugging him goodbye, and me going, I'll text you. And then apologizing for being so awkward, and him going, haha, aren't we all? Typing this out makes me want to bleach my brain and groan into oblivion. I speedwalk home replaying what the fuck just happened, And once I get home, I yell to my roommates the entire story. Cue roommates going, "You spent 3 hours piking Min, but not the right one. You spent the entire night playing with the wrong joystick," and more, etc. Anyway, my F up was obviously those awkward moments, and also I have to go to therapy about this, because for the past 3 days I've just been thinking about how I'm not living my life to the fullest, and instead of letting how he lives his life inspire me, it just turns me into an anxious ball thinking about how I'm a bum and don't do enough, and how quickly I gave up on living a life like his, because it's so easy for me to just blame my brain on how it can't handle executive functions properly. And now I'm in anxious overdrive, trying to get as much done as possible with a really long to-do list of things I aspire to, but it's driven by anxiety instead of a genuine inspiration. So that's something new to tell my therapist. I wasn't looking for anything serious. A simple coffee date, a chance to meet someone new, maybe even spark a connection. That's all I wanted when I met her. Let's call her Emma. We'd exchanged a few messages online, nothing too intense, but enough to convince me she was worth meeting in person. She was funny, quick-witted, and had this charmingly blunt way of talking that felt refreshing. So when she suggested grabbing coffee at a little cafe downtown, I thought, why not? That afternoon, the weather was perfect, crisp, sunny, the kind of day that makes you feel like anything is possible. I arrived a few minutes early, ordered a black coffee, and chose a table by the window. When Emma walked in, she was exactly how I imagined, confident, smiling, and effortlessly cool. I couldn't have known that by the end of the date, she'd be telling me my destiny. Things started off well enough. We talked about the usual first date stuff, work, hobbies, favorite shows. She was animated, gesturing wildly as she described her latest obsession with some obscure crime documentary. I found myself relaxing, enjoying the easy flow of conversation. At one point, the topic shifted to past relationships. It wasn't anything heavy, just a natural progression of getting to know each other. She asked how many relationships I'd been in, and I answered honestly. "Just one," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "It lasted 7 years." Her eyes widened slightly, and she leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. 7 years? That's a long time. "Yeah," I said, shrugging. "We were together through most of my 20s. It didn't work out in the end, but we stayed on good terms. She's a great person." Emma nodded thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to curiosity. But then she asked a question I hadn't been expecting. "Why aren't you still together?" I hesitated. It wasn't a question I'd had to answer often, mostly because I rarely talked about my ex on dates. But Emma's tone wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious. So I gave her the short version. "We grew apart," I said simply. "Wanted different things. It was mutual." She tilted her head, her brow furrowing, as if I'd just told her something incomprehensible. "But you were together for 7 years." "Yeah," I said slowly, unsure where she was going with this. "That's a long time, but it doesn't mean it was meant to last forever." Emma leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I don't know," she said, her tone turning serious. 7 years? That's not just some fling. That's destiny." I blinked. "Destiny?" She nodded, her expression solemn now. "You don't spend 7 years with someone unless they're your soulmate. You need to get back together with her." For a moment, I thought she was joking. I even let out a nervous laugh, waiting for her to crack a smile or say, "Just kidding." But she didn't. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with conviction. "Emma," I said, setting my coffee cup down, "I don't think you understand. We broke up for a reason. It's been a couple of years. She's moved on. I've moved on." She shook her head, leaning forward again. "No, you haven't. Not really. You can't move on from something like that. It's fate. You're supposed to be with her." I was at a loss for words. How do you respond to someone who's decided they know your life better than you do? "Look," I said carefully, "I appreciate your perspective, but I'm pretty sure I know my own destiny better than anyone else." She ignored me, her voice gaining momentum. "No, listen to me. You're wasting your time dating other people. She's the one for you. You need to stop all of this, these apps, these dates, and go find her. Fight for her." I stared at her, my brain struggling to process what was happening. Was this real? Was I actually sitting in a coffee shop with a woman who, just 30 minutes ago, had been laughing about crime documentaries, and now she was lecturing me about my supposed soulmate? "Emma," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, "I don't think you understand how relationships work. Just because you're with someone for a long time doesn't mean it's meant to be forever." Her eyes narrowed. But what if it was? What if you gave up too soon? What if she's sitting somewhere right now, waiting for you to come back? I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, grabbing my coat. I think we're done here, I said, my voice clipped. She looked surprised, almost offended. You're leaving? Yes, I said firmly. Because this isn't a conversation, it's a lecture. And frankly, I don't need a stranger telling me who I'm supposed to love. As I walked out of the cafe, my head was spinning. What had just happened? How had a simple coffee date turned into an impromptu intervention? The audacity of it all was staggering. By the time I got home, I was still replaying the conversation in my mind. It was absurd, laughable even, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the strangeness of it all. Who does that? Who meets someone for the first time and decides to play matchmaker with their ex? The next day, I received a message from Emma. I really hope you think about what I said. It read, you deserve to be happy. With her. I blocked her immediately. My first foray into Tinder was supposed to be a simple, low-stakes evening. It was about 6 years ago, and I figured it was time to give online dating a shot. Swipe, chat, meet, repeat. That was the idea. What could possibly go wrong? I matched with a woman who seemed decent. Her photos were nice, her profile was engaging, and our chats were lighthearted and fun. I made a reservation at a cozy restaurant, something casual but still a step above coffee, and we agreed to meet there. I remember feeling that strange mix of nerves and anticipation as I walked into the restaurant. But when I saw her sitting at the table, I stopped short. She looked nothing like her photos. It wasn't just a bad angle or lighting. It was as if I'd matched with an entirely different person. The polished, vibrant woman from the photos was replaced by someone who looked like she'd wandered in by mistake. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn around and leave, but my upbringing got the better of me. Be polite. Be decent. Everyone deserves a chance, right? I plastered on a smile and joined her at the table, determined to make the best of it. Maybe her personality would shine through. Maybe there was a reason she'd chosen such wildly misleading pictures. The waiter came, drinks were ordered, and soon we were making the usual first date small talk. But then the conversation took a turn. So, she said, swirling her wine glass, why are you on Tinder? I gave the standard answer about wanting to meet new people, hoping to find someone special, and asked her the same question. Her response was something else. Well, she began, her voice dropping conspiratorially, my last relationship ended badly. That's never a great start, but I nodded politely, prompting her to continue. She leaned forward, her tone becoming serious. My boyfriend's girlfriend told me that my boyfriend was actually married. I blinked, unsure if I'd misheard. Wait, your boyfriend's girlfriend? Yeah, she said, completely unfazed. He had a girlfriend and a wife. None of us knew about each other. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around the layers of deception in her story. So, how did you not know he was married? He looked a lot younger than he was, she explained, taking another sip of wine. He said he was 50, but he was really older. I raised an eyebrow. How much older? She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her photos before showing me a picture. This is him. The man staring back at me from her screen looked closer to 60, if not 65. At that point, I felt like I was trapped in a bad sitcom. How had this become my life? I'd walked into this evening expecting an ordinary first date, and now I was dissecting the double life of a man who had somehow juggled a wife, a girlfriend, and another girlfriend. I decided I'd had enough. Listen, I said gently, I really appreciate the date, but I don't think we're a match. I wish you all the best, but I think it's better if we go our separate ways. She looked surprised but didn't argue. I paid the bill, thanked her for her time, and excused myself. Relief washed over me as I stepped outside and called for a grab to take me home. But as I waited for the car, I noticed her standing next to me. I turned to her, confused. What are you doing? She shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. So, where are we going? I stared at her, trying to keep my voice calm. I'm going to my home, and you're going to your home, I said, using my hands to gesture in opposite directions. She didn't say anything, just stood there watching me as I got into the car and left. I thought that was the end of it. The next morning, I was jolted out of bed by the sound of my doorbell ringing. Groggy and disoriented, I checked the video feed connected to my intercom, and my heart sank. It was her. She stood outside my door, shouting up at the camera, "Why haven't you texted me back? I thought we had a good time. Why are you ghosting me?" I rubbed my temples, trying to process what was happening. I told you last night we weren't seeing each other again, I said into the intercom, my voice sharper than I intended. Her expression crumpled. But why? I thought we had a connection. At this point, my patience had run out. We didn't, I said bluntly. Please leave. She started crying, loud, dramatic sobs that echoed through the quiet morning. I turned off the intercom, unwilling to engage any further. I watched through the video feed as she stood there for a while, sniffling and wiping her eyes, before finally walking away. For weeks, I kept expecting her to show up again. I considered changing my address, but since I used my home as my office, it wasn't a practical option. Fortunately, she never came back. 2 months later, I swiped right on someone new. This time, the experience was completely different. There were no misleading photos, no bizarre stories, no uninvited visits to my front door. Just genuine conversation, mutual respect, and the beginnings of something real. That woman is now my wife. Dating, they say, is supposed to be an adventure. At best, it's a journey toward connection, laughter, and shared dreams. At worst, it's a series of awkward encounters that you laugh about later. I've had my fair share of both, but a few dates stand out in my memory, not for their charm or romance, but for the sheer absurdity of it all. Take the first woman, for example. Let's call her Sarah. We'd been chatting for a while before we decided to meet up, and our first few dates went well. She was smart, funny, and seemed refreshingly straightforward. But things started to unravel by date 5. It began with what seemed like a small misunderstanding. We'd planned to meet for dinner, and her office was just 5 minutes away from the restaurant. I figured it made sense for us to meet there, especially since she'd been so insistent on keeping things fair, splitting the bill on every date, never letting me pay more than my share. I admired her independence, so I didn't think twice about it, but when I arrived at the restaurant, I could tell something was off. She was already seated, arms crossed, her smile notably absent. "You didn't offer to pick me up," she said, her tone sharp. I blinked, caught off guard. "I thought since it's so close." She cut me off with a dismissive wave. "It's the principle, not the distance." The evening went downhill from there. By the end of the meal, her irritation had simmered into a cold, distant politeness. A few days later, she ended things, her reasoning as baffling as the rest of it. "I need someone who's willing to fight for me," she said, her voice dripping with finality. "You never even tried to insist on paying the bill." I stood there, dumbfounded. Was this a test? Some kind of secret code I was supposed to crack? I never found out. Then there was the woman who, halfway through a pleasant lunch date, dragged me into a high-end boutique. Let's call her Emily. We'd just finished our meal, and I thought things were going well, until she suddenly stopped in front of a Furla store, her eyes lighting up like a kid in a candy shop. Without a word, she walked in, gesturing for me to follow. "Look at this one," she said, holding up a sleek black handbag. "Isn't it gorgeous?" It was. But before I could respond, she added, "You'd look so good carrying this for me." I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. "Yeah, it's nice." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Well, what? Aren't you going to offer to get it for me?" I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. She wasn't joking. Her smile faltered as the silence stretched between us. "I don't think that's appropriate," I said carefully. Her expression soured immediately. Without another word, she put the bag back on the shelf and stormed out of the store, leaving me standing there like an idiot. Needless to say, I never heard from her again. But the strangest date of all, the one that still makes me question reality, was with a woman I'll call Kate. We'd agreed to meet for coffee, and things started out normal enough. She was warm, engaging, and had a sharp wit that I found refreshing. But then, out of nowhere, she dropped a bombshell. "So let's talk about kinks," she said, her tone casual, as if she were suggesting we discuss our favorite movies. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Kinks?" I repeated, caught completely off guard. "Yeah," she said, leaning in with an eager glint in her eye. "I think it's important to be upfront about these things. For example, I like being slapped." I stared at her, unsure if I'd misheard. "Slapped?" "Full force," she clarified. "Across the face." My mind scrambled for an appropriate response. Was this a test? Some kind of icebreaker I didn't understand? But she wasn't finished. "My dad used to do it," she said matter-of-factly, and I guess it kind of stuck with me. The air left the room. My coffee cup hovered mid-air as I tried to process what she'd just said. Was she being serious? Was this a joke? Or some twisted attempt at vulnerability? "I don't think I can relate to that," I managed to say, my voice shaking slightly. She shrugged, completely unbothered. Fair enough. But hey, at least I'm honest. I sat there, stunned, unsure if I was part of some elaborate prank or if this was genuinely her idea of first date conversation. To this day, I still don't know. We matched online, exchanged a few messages, and quickly realized we had a great rapport. He was funny, clever, and refreshingly attentive. He said he lived in a town not far from mine, which made meeting up a breeze. After a couple of phone calls that lasted into the early hours of the morning, I found myself genuinely excited. He seemed normal. When he suggested dinner for our first date, I eagerly agreed. The plan was simple: meet at a cozy little restaurant, have a nice meal, and see if the chemistry we'd built online translated to the real world. I should have known it was too good to be true. The first red flag was waiting for me at the restaurant door. He looked different from his photos, not just a little older or a few pounds heavier, but almost unrecognizable. I'm not one to judge too harshly. Online photos can be deceiving. But this wasn't a case of bad lighting or strategic angles. He looked like he'd aged a decade since the pictures were taken. His nervous smile didn't help, and I felt a flicker of unease. Still, I told myself to stay open-minded. After all, I'd come this far. What was the harm in giving him a chance? I wish I'd turned around and left. We hadn't even ordered drinks before the conversation took a hard left turn into Crazy Town. I like you, he said, leaning forward across the table, his voice low and deliberate. His eyes bore into mine with an intensity that made me instinctively lean back. We should have a baby. I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. I'm sorry, what? You heard me, he said, completely unfazed by my reaction. Are you ovulating? For a second, I thought this had to be a joke, some bizarre attempt at humor gone horribly wrong. But there was no laughter in his expression, no trace of levity. He was deadly serious. I froze, my mind racing. How do you even respond to something like that? I forced a strained laugh, hoping to defuse the tension. That's not really first date conversation. But he didn't back down. Why not? It's important to be upfront about these things. I felt my stomach twist as a wave of panic set in. This wasn't just awkward, it was alarming. I needed to leave. Fast. I think this isn't going to work out, I said, pushing back my chair and reaching for my bag. Wait, where are you going? He asked, standing up as I did. His tone wasn't angry, but there was an unsettling edge of desperation in his voice. I'm leaving, I said firmly, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. This is too much. I turned and started walking toward the exit, but he followed, his footsteps quickening behind me. My pulse spiked as I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a jolt of adrenaline. What are you doing? I snapped, spinning to face him. Why are you following me? His response made my blood run cold. I don't have anywhere to go, he said simply, as if that explained everything. I lied about where I live. My heart sank. What are you talking about? I don't live nearby, he admitted, his tone matter of fact. I drove 4 hours to meet you. I figured I could stay with you tonight. The audacity of his words left me momentarily speechless. He'd not only lied about his location, but had somehow convinced himself that I, someone he'd never met in person until tonight, would let him crash at my place. Absolutely not, I said, my voice rising with anger. You need to leave. Now. He tried to argue, but I wasn't having it. I turned and walked away, my every instinct screaming at me to get as far from him as possible. I didn't look back until I was safely in my car, my hands trembling as I locked the doors. The next morning, I woke to a text from an unknown number. My stomach churned as I opened it, already dreading what I'd find. I miss you already, the message read, complete with a winking emoji. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Miss me? You terrified me. I didn't hesitate. I blocked him immediately, deleting the message, as if erasing it could somehow undo the entire nightmare of a date. I was already at the table, stomach growling, and checking the time for what felt like the 100th time. He was late. Not fashionably late. Not the kind of late that gives you butterflies while you wait, wondering if this person is as charming in real life as they seemed online. No. This was no regard for basic etiquette late. It was supposed to be a casual lunch, nothing fancy, just a simple meet and greet to see if the spark we had online translated into something real. But as the minutes dragged on, that spark was flickering out. When I finally worked up the nerve to text him and ask for his ETA, his response floored me. I'll be 30 minutes late. Just start eating if you're hungry. No apology. No explanation. Just a casual suggestion to carry on without him. I stared at my phone, trying to decide if I was more annoyed by his lack of effort or by the fact that my hunger was winning this battle. I ordered something small to tide me over and told myself to let it go. First dates are nerve-wracking. Maybe he'd had a rough morning. Maybe he was shy and fumbling. My inner optimist was working overtime to drown out my growing irritation. Finally, more than 30 minutes past his promised arrival, he showed up. At first, I didn't recognize him. The guy who'd been sending me playful texts and witty jokes online was replaced by someone who looked like he'd rolled out of bed and wandered into the wrong restaurant. His hair stuck out in every direction, a literal bird's nest of tangles and neglect. He wore a wrinkled promotional t-shirt from some random event, baggy shorts that screamed laundry day, and a pair of flip-flops that looked like they'd seen better days. No apology, no sheepish grin, just a chirpy, "Hey," as he plopped into the seat across from me. I blinked at him, momentarily at a loss for words. This wasn't just a casual approach to a casual lunch. This was a complete disregard for the fact that he was on a date. I tried to hide my shock, but I could feel my expression slipping. Did he think this was acceptable? Did he think I'd find this charmingly quirky? As he reached for the menu, my patience snapped. "I'm sorry," I said, forcing a tight smile. "I'm really tired. I think I need to head home." He looked up, confusion flashing across his face, but there was no real concern. No attempt to salvage the date or even to ask if everything was okay. "Oh, okay," he said with a shrug, already turning his attention back to the menu. I stood, grabbed my bag, and walked away, each step feeling lighter as the distance between us grew. The cool air outside was a welcome relief, and as I put more and more space between myself and that disastrous date, the absurdity of the situation began to sink in. How had I even let it get to this point? I'd walked into that restaurant expecting effort, respect, and maybe even a bit of romance. Instead, I'd been met with bedhead and a complete lack of accountability. Once I was far enough away, I pulled out my phone and blocked him. No follow-up messages. No second chances. I wasn't going to waste another second on someone who couldn't even bother to apologize for being late, let alone put in the bare minimum effort to show up looking presentable. As I walked home, I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. I'd thought that someone who wasn't conventionally attractive might try harder, might take the time to impress, knowing they didn't have the luxury of coasting on their looks. But this was a new low. I replayed the scene in my head, from his nonchalant arrival to his oblivious attitude. For a moment, I wondered if I'd overreacted. Was I being too harsh? Too judgmental? But no, this wasn't about appearances. It was about respect, and he hadn't shown any. Not for me, not for the date, not even for himself. When I got home, I kicked off my shoes, sank onto the couch, and let out a deep breath. The frustration I'd felt earlier was already fading, replaced by a strange sense of relief. I'd dodged a bullet. This wasn't a loss, it was a win. I opened my phone, scrolled through my messages, and deleted our entire chat history. As I watched the conversation disappear, I felt a surge of empowerment. One bad date didn't define me, and it certainly didn't mean I had to lower my standards. The lesson was clear: never settle for someone who makes you feel like you're an afterthought. Because if they can't even bother to try on the first date, what hope is there for the future? It's funny now looking back. The absurdity of it all has turned the frustration into something I can laugh about. But at the time, it was a wake-up call, a reminder to value myself and to never let anyone treat me as though I'm not worth the effort. But when I matched with Ryan on Tinder a few years ago, it felt like I'd struck gold. He was handsome in a way that made you do a double take, sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could probably sell you anything. More than that, he was funny and charming. The kind of guy who had you checking your phone constantly, grinning at every notification. When he asked me out, I didn't hesitate. "We'll grab food," he said. Simple, straightforward, low pressure. Perfect. On the day of the date, he even drove an hour to pick me up. I remember seeing him step out of the car, and he was even more striking in person. His confidence was magnetic, and as we drove, the conversation flowed effortlessly. I found myself thinking, wow, he's the real deal. That optimism lasted until he mentioned a barbecue. "It's just a quick stop," he said casually, flashing me a smile. "Some of my friends are having a barbecue. You don't mind, do you?" I hesitated. Meeting someone's friends on a first date wasn't exactly what I'd signed up for, but I didn't want to seem uptight. "Sure," I said, trying to sound breezy. A quick stop sounds fine. As we pulled up to a large, beautiful house, my unease grew. The driveway was packed with cars, and the sound of music and laughter spilled out into the street. "This doesn't look like just a few friends," I said, glancing at him. He laughed. "Yeah, it's my sister's engagement party." I stared at him, stunned. "You're taking me to a family event? On our first date?" "It'll be fun," he said, already getting out of the car. Before I could protest, he was at my door, gesturing for me to follow. The moment we stepped inside, I realized I was in way over my head. The house was packed, people milling about in every room, drinks in hand, laughter echoing off the walls. Ryan introduced me to person after person, barely giving me time to process their names. His parents, his uncles, cousins, neighbors, I lost track. Then, before I knew it, I was face to face with his mom and grandmother. "Oh, you're the girl Ryan's been talking about," his mom said, smiling warmly. "It's so nice to meet you." My stomach sank. What has he been saying? "Lovely to meet you," I managed to say, forcing a smile while my brain screamed. "I don't even know this guy." Meanwhile, Ryan had disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone with his family. I made polite small talk, trying not to look like a deer in headlights, but the absurdity of the situation was sinking in fast. It wasn't long before things spiraled even further. Ryan, now several drinks in, was off with his friends, completely ignoring me. His family, however, was all too eager to include me in the festivities. By the time I spotted him again, we were all heading to the local pub for the after-party. I thought about slipping away, calling for a ride, but I felt trapped. Everyone was so friendly, and leaving without an explanation felt rude. So I went along, telling myself this would all be over soon. The pub was chaos. Drinks were flowing, a live band was playing, and the energy was wild. And that's when things hit their peak. His grandmother, yes, his grandmother, climbed onto the bar. To the sound of Zombie by the Cranberries, she danced like she was living her best life, the crowd cheering her on. I'll admit, for a moment, I forgot how insane the night was and just stood there, laughing in disbelief. Then I saw her, Ryan's ex-girlfriend. She spotted me from across the room, her eyes narrowing like a hawk locking onto its prey. She marched over, drink in hand, and leaned in close, her voice sharp. "So, you're the homewrecker," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Excuse me?" I said, blinking in confusion. She didn't hold back, launching into a tirade about how Ryan was hers, how I had no business being there, and how I was clearly trying to ruin her life. I was too stunned to respond. "Homewrecker? I just met this guy." By the time Ryan stumbled over to intervene, the damage was done. His ex stormed off, leaving me standing there, humiliated and furious. Ryan, oblivious to the chaos he'd caused, slurred something incoherent, and then dropped the biggest bombshell of the night. "I love you," he said, swaying slightly as he grabbed my arm. "I've never felt this way about anyone." Before I could respond, he doubled over and vomited. On my shoes. That was the breaking point. I didn't care how handsome he was, or how charming he'd seemed in our messages. I didn't care that his family was lovely, or that his grandmother had just delivered the performance of the century. I was done. I pulled out my phone and called a friend, begging them to pick me up. As I waited outside, Ryan tried to follow me, mumbling apologies and asking if I wanted to come back to his place. I ignored him, keeping my distance until my friend's car pulled up. "Is that him?" my friend asked as I climbed into the passenger seat, motioning toward Ryan, who was now sitting on the curb looking pitiful. "Yep," I said, slamming the door. "Drive." The next day I deleted Tinder. I didn't block Ryan, but I never responded to his follow-up messages. Every time I thought about that night, the engagement party, the ex, the declaration of love, the vomit, I couldn't help but cringe. I met him at a dimly lit pub, the kind of place where the music is just loud enough to drown out your better judgment. He was charming in a rugged, rough-around-the-edges way, the kind of guy who made you feel like the most fascinating person in the room. His stories were wild, his laugh infectious. When he invited me back to his place, I hesitated, but only for a moment. I told myself it was part of the adventure, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited behind his front door. His apartment was the polar opposite of his charisma. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt the air shift. It wasn't just messy, it was chaos frozen in time. Clothes were strewn everywhere, dishes piled high in the sink, and a faint, stale odor hung in the air. But I convinced myself to look past it. People can be messy, right? Besides, it wasn't like I'd come here expecting a 5-star experience. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, motioning toward a couch that had definitely seen better days. "I've got something I want to show you." Before I could respond, he disappeared into another room. I sat down gingerly, trying not to think about what might be lurking between the cushions. The minutes dragged on, the sound of drawers opening and closing breaking the silence. When he finally returned, he was holding something in his hands. A stack of papers, worn and yellowed at the edges, tied together with a frayed piece of string. "I want to share this with you," he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "It's my poetry. Now, I like poetry as much as the next person." But when he added, "I wrote it while I was in Mountjoy," my stomach did a little flip. "Mountjoy? As in the prison?" "Mountjoy?" I echoed, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Yeah," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I did some time there. Long story. But these poems, they got me through it." He sat down across from me, untying the string with care, as if unwrapping a sacred relic. He handed me the first page, his eyes watching mine intently as I read. The words were raw, heavy with anger and regret. They were scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting, like they'd been ripped straight from his soul. "It's intense," I said, handing the page back. "Prison changes you," he replied, his gaze distant now. "Makes you see the world differently. You want to hear one?" Before I could answer, he started reciting, his voice low and gravelly, each word punctuated with emotion. It was haunting, beautiful in its way, but also deeply unsettling. By the time he finished, I was struggling to figure out how to respond. But before I could come up with something diplomatic, he clapped his hands together and grinned. "You need a drink," he said, jumping up and heading for the kitchen. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, glancing around the room. That's when I noticed the faint but unmistakable stench growing stronger. My eyes wandered toward the small hallway, leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. Curiosity got the better of me. I stood, taking a tentative step toward the hallway. The closer I got, the more potent the smell became. It wasn't just bad. It was foul, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and lingers in your nostrils. When I finally peeked into the bathroom, my stomach turned. The toilet had no door. None. Just an open, doorless frame leading into a space that could generously be described as a health hazard. And on the wall, God help me, there was something smeared there. Brown, unmistakable. My mind rebelled against the obvious conclusion, but there was no denying it. Shit! On the wall. I froze, a mix of horror and disbelief washing over me. This wasn't just a messy apartment. This was a nightmare. "What do you think?" His voice called from the other room, startling me. "The poetry, I mean." I turned back toward the living room, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's unique," I managed to say, my throat dry. "Really powerful." He appeared in the hallway, holding two mismatched glasses filled with some unidentifiable liquid. He noticed where I was standing, his expression shifting slightly. "Oh yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Meant to get that fixed." "Fixed? Fixed? That wasn't something you fix. That was something you burned, cleansed, and exorcised." I realized then and there that I needed to leave. Immediately. I just remembered. "I've got an early morning tomorrow," I blurted out, edging toward the door. "I should probably get going." He looked disappointed, but didn't argue. "All right," he said, handing me one of the glasses anyway. "At least have a sip before you go." I didn't. Instead, I set the glass down on the nearest surface, muttered a quick thanks for the poetry, and bolted out the door before he could say anything else. The moment I stepped outside, the fresh air hit me like a blessing. As I walked home, the absurdity of the night started to sink in. The prison poetry, the toilet without a door, the wall. It was almost too much to process. By the time I reached my apartment, I was laughing, partly out of relief, partly out of disbelief. I should have known from the start that this night was going to take a bizarre turn. Maybe it was the way he confidently poured milk into a glass of whiskey, swirling the concoction with the kind of flourish usually reserved for fine cocktails. He looked at me over the rim of the glass, a crooked grin on his face, as if daring me to judge him. "That's an interesting choice," I said, trying to keep the judgment out of my voice. He laughed, taking a long sip. "Trust me, it's good." Spoiler, it wasn't. But at that moment, I convinced myself it was just one of those harmless quirks, something that might make a good story to tell my friends later. I wasn't prepared for what the morning had in store. The night itself was unremarkable. We'd met at a bar, his confidence catching my attention in a way that felt refreshing, if not a little reckless. After a few drinks and some easy conversation, he invited me back to his place. It wasn't the kind of offer I usually accepted, but something about his crooked smile and casual charm made me say yes. His apartment was about what I expected: mismatched furniture, dishes piled in the sink, and a faint musty smell that clung to the air. But I wasn't there to critique his housekeeping. We spent the night talking, laughing, and eventually drifting into a fitful sleep on his lumpy mattress. Morning came too soon. At 7 a.m. sharp, I woke to the sound of his alarm blaring. He groaned, rolled over, and promptly ignored it, leaving me wide awake in the unfamiliar room. After a few minutes of lying there, contemplating my life choices, he finally stirred. "You should come with me today," he said groggily, propping himself up on one elbow. I blinked at him, confused. "Come with you where?" "To work," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It'll be fun." I raised an eyebrow. "Fun? Washing dishes in a kitchen." "Yeah, why not?" He grinned, his enthusiasm bizarrely genuine. "It's not as bad as it sounds. You'll get free food." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. I mumbled something about needing to get home, but he wasn't letting it go. He leaned closer, his voice taking on a strange, almost pleading tone. "Come on," he said. "It'll be a good time." I needed an escape, and fast. "Let me just use the bathroom," I said, sliding out of bed before he could protest. The bathroom door was just a few steps away, but the moment I opened it, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in all his glory, was a man, completely naked, brush in hand, painting the bathroom door. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. The man, clearly in his 60s, turned to look at me without a hint of shame or surprise, his expression calm and focused. "Morning," he said casually, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I gawked at him, my brain scrambling to catch up. This wasn't just any man. This was his father, painting the bathroom door. Naked. At 7 in the morning. I didn't know what to do. My fight-or-flight instincts were warring with each other, leaving me frozen in the doorway. The smell of paint thinner filled the small bathroom, adding to the surrealness of the scene. "I'll be done in a minute," his dad said, turning back to his work with the same nonchalant demeanor. I muttered something incoherent and backed away, closing the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I could feel the beginnings of hysterical laughter bubbling up in my chest. I needed to get out of there, immediately. When I returned to the bedroom, he was still lounging in bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up at me, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the next room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual. I opened my mouth to tell him about the naked man painting the bathroom door, but stopped myself. What was the point? Instead, I forced a smile. "I think I'm gonna head out." He frowned. "Really? But I thought you might." No, I interrupted, grabbing my things as quickly as possible. "I've got a lot to do today. Thanks for everything." He didn't press the issue, just shrugged and nodded. I was halfway out the door before he could change his mind. As I stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit me like a wake-up call. I walked briskly down the street, trying to process what had just happened. The milk and whiskey guy, the dishwashing job invitation, the naked father painting at dawn. By the time I reached the corner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I burst out laughing, the sound echoing down the empty street. It was ridiculous, absurd, the kind of story that felt too strange to be real. But it was. Later, when I told my friends about the encounter, they were in hysterics, begging for every detail. "Why didn't you just leave when he poured the milk and whiskey?" one of them asked, tears streaming down her face. "I thought that was the red flag," I said. "Turns out it was just the appetizer." Date 1 went pretty well. We hit it off, she's cute. I ask what book she's reading. She says, "I'm reading about the history of Thomas Aquinas." I'm not particularly religious, but I was raised Catholic. We get into a great conversation about the medieval church and its effect on the world. Smart, cute, funny. Definitely a second date. Date 2, after a meal and a drink, she asks, "What are your 5-year plans?" I think she's joking and say, quoting The Office, "I plan to be 5 years sober." No response. The Office, never heard of it. Huh. Okay, what are your 5-year plans? I plan to be married and have at least 2 kids. Huh. Flash to. Can you give me a ride home? Sure, I say. But the ride home is well outside of the city to a pretty rural part of my small state. She's giving me directions, and it's getting more and more in the middle of nowhere. We finally turn onto a long driveway that belongs to a large piece of land with a tall fence around it. I drive up slowly. "You live here?" "Oh yeah." I live with a family here. A family? Yeah, I met them through my church. I spot a golf cart driven by a woman with a teenage boy passenger, just coasting back and forth along the perimeter of the property. I don't ask about them. Do you want to come in and see my plants? We had a common interest in gardening. Sure. But before we can go in, a tall, thick man stops us. Turns out he owns the property. He's a state trooper and built this place for his family to prepare for the Y2K bug, when society was supposed to fall apart. IT didn't, but thank God I did, because we got that guy in the White House now, right? Ha, yeah. I got a whole armory just in case. Oh wow, okay. The girl leads me into the house and shows me not a few plants, but at least 200 seedlings under grow lights. She enthusiastically points out tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, etc. We could feed dozens of people with these plants. Whoa, this is way more than the casual gardening I talked about. Yeah, well, I take things to extreme. There's a loud, animal shriek behind me. What was that? Oh, that's just James. Do you want to meet him? She leads me to the living room where the windows are blacked out and a projector is showing a muted TV land on the wall in 20 glorious feet. James is over here. I walk over to a bedroom which has a door off its hinges and set on its side, blocking the doorway, from which you can see the TV projection. Inside is the teenage boy I saw on the golf cart earlier. It turns out he's severely retarded, and the only thing that calms him is the television. But he doesn't do well with strange men, so he starts screaming and screaming and screaming as he runs back and forth in his empty bedroom. My date is trying to calm him down, and is doing this awkward shrug/smile combo like, kids these days, am I right? I excuse myself, saying I'm clearly upsetting him. I'm almost running to my car. But before I can jump in it, the state trooper stops me and says, I didn't want to say it in front of my date, but I think shit's going to hit the fan pretty soon. When it does, you'll always have a spot here. Great, thanks, bye. My date is at the window. I had a lot of fun. When can I see you next? I'll call you. I did not. It was one of those early spring evenings, where the air had just a hint of warmth, teasing the promise of summer. The kind of evening that made me feel hopeful, maybe even optimistic. I had met him on a dating app a few weeks earlier. His profile was unremarkable, but his messages were charming enough. Witty, quick responses that made me think, why not give this a chance? But from the moment we met, something felt off. We'd agreed on a walk, something casual and low pressure. When I arrived, he was already there, leaning against a bench with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His grin was easy, confident, as he greeted me with a quick once-over. You look great, he said, his voice smooth but lacking sincerity. So, where are we eating? The question caught me off guard. Eating? I repeated. Yeah, he said, already turning as if the matter was settled. I'm starving. Let's grab something. I hesitated. It wasn't that I minded grabbing a bite, but the assumption grated on me. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe he was nervous, or maybe he'd misread the vibe of our plans. Either way, I figured I'd go along with it, for now. We found a small cafe, the kind with cozy booths and menus that tried too hard to be fancy. As we sat down, he didn't bother opening his menu. Instead, he scanned mine over my shoulder, pointing out the most expensive options. Go ahead, he said, grinning. You can get me the steak. I froze, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. Excuse me? I didn't bring any money, he said, his tone casual, as if this were a completely normal thing to admit. But don't worry, I'll pay you back later. I stared at him, the first stirrings of annoyance bubbling in my chest. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment situation where he'd forgotten his wallet. He'd planned this, deliberately, but against my better judgment, I nodded. The waiter came, and he ordered the steak, medium rare, with an expensive cocktail to match. I stuck to something simple, my appetite waning under the weight of my irritation. The meal was awkward. He talked endlessly, mostly about himself, barely stopping to ask me a single question. When the food arrived, he barely acknowledged my presence, too busy devouring his steak with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't eaten in days. When the check came, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for me to pick it up. I paid without a word, my frustration simmering just below the surface. I told myself I'd end the night soon, make up some excuse to leave. But then he dropped the next bombshell. Can you lend me 20 euros? He asked as we stepped outside, his tone so casual it made my head spin. What? I said, stopping in my tracks. Why? I've got a few things I need to pick up tomorrow, he said, shrugging. I'll pay you back. Promise. I should have said no. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to walk away, to cut my losses and never look back. But instead, I sighed and handed over the money, more out of disbelief than anything else. "Thanks," he said, slipping the bill into his pocket without so much as a thank you. "You're really generous, you know that?" By this point, I was done. I just wanted to go home, crawl into bed, and pretend this date had never happened. But, of course, it wasn't that simple. As we walked toward the nearest bus stop, he glanced at me again. "You wouldn't happen to have bus fare, would you?" he asked. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at him in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Come on," he said, grinning like this was all some big joke. "It's not like I'm asking for much." I bit back a sharp retort, shaking my head. "I'm getting a taxi," I said firmly. "It'll pass your house. I'll drop you off." What happened next took this nightmare of a date to a whole new level. He stopped walking, his face suddenly serious. "Why do you want to know where I live?" I blinked at him, completely thrown. "What? Is that your plan?" he asked, his voice rising. "You're trying to find out where I live, aren't you?" The accusation hit me like a slap, leaving me momentarily speechless. "Are you kidding me?" I said finally, my voice sharp. "I'm offering to help you get home." "That's it." He crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "Seems suspicious," he muttered. At that moment, I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who was merely inconsiderate or thoughtless. This was something else entirely: paranoia, entitlement, maybe even a touch of delusion. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. "You know what?" I said, taking a step back. "Forget it. Find your own way home." Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and relief. Behind me, I heard him call out, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. The taxi ride home was blissfully quiet, the soft hum of the engine soothing my frayed nerves. As I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, disbelief, and a simmering anger at myself for letting the date go on as long as it had. The next day, when I recounted the story to a friend, she couldn't stop laughing. "You actually gave him 20 euros, she said, doubling over. "What were you thinking?" "I wasn't," I admitted. "But hey, at least I've got a story." When I was 17, I was the guy who could barely string 2 sentences together around a girl without turning bright red. Shy doesn't even begin to cover it. I was practically invisible, especially when it came to anyone I found remotely attractive. But there was this girl. She came into the pub where I worked every so often with her friends, a whirlwind of laughter and effortless charm. She wasn't just pretty, she was radiant. Every time she walked in, the whole room seemed to brighten. I'd steal glances while pulling pints, my heart racing every time her eyes skimmed past mine. It was agony, watching her from afar, knowing I'd never have the courage to speak to her. But one day, something shifted. Maybe it was the way her smile lingered, or maybe it was the way my co-workers nudged me with teasing grins whenever she walked in. Whatever it was, I decided I had to do something. Anything. So I asked her out. It wasn't suave. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even coherent. One minute I was wiping down the bar as she laughed with her friends, and the next I was standing in front of her, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, a chaotic blur of stammering that barely resembled a question. Her laughter stopped, her friends went silent, and she blinked at me, clearly trying to make sense of what had just happened. For a moment, I wanted to disappear into the floor. But then, to my shock, she smiled. Sure," she said, still looking a little unsure. "Tomorrow night at 9? I nodded, too stunned to speak, and fled back behind the bar. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. She'd said yes. The next day was a whirlwind of preparation. I wasn't just going on a date. I was transforming myself. I spent hours picking out the perfect outfit, borrowed some aftershave from my dad, a little too much in hindsight, and even picked up flowers and chocolates. It was over the top, but I didn't care. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to mess it up. By the time I arrived at the pub, I was practically vibrating with nerves. My palms were sweaty, the flowers trembling slightly in my grip. But I was ready. I was going to walk in there, flash a confident smile, and sweep her off her feet. Then I saw her. She was sitting at a table near the back, surrounded by people. 7 of them, to be exact. My heart sank as I took in the scene. There she was, laughing and chatting, completely at ease. And there, right beside her, was a guy with his arms slung casually around her shoulders. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated the kind of confidence I could only dream of. Her boyfriend. The room seemed to tilt as I stood frozen in the doorway, clutching my ridiculous bouquet of flowers and the box of chocolates that now felt like a cruel joke. What was I supposed to do? Turn around and leave? Pretend this wasn't happening? Before I could make a decision, she spotted me. Her eyes widened for a split second before she smiled and waved me over. I walked to the table like a man marching to his doom. Every step felt heavier than the last, and by the time I reached her, my carefully rehearsed introduction had completely evaporated. The guy next to her, the boyfriend, eyed me curiously. "What's with the flowers and chocolates?" he asked, his tone friendly but clearly amused. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. My brain scrambled for an explanation, but all I could manage was a series of half-formed syllables. I could feel my face burning, the weight of everyone's eyes on me. Before the silence could stretch too long, she stepped in. "They're for Claire," she said smoothly, gesturing to one of her friends at the table. My head snapped toward her in shock. "Claire?" I hadn't even noticed her sitting there, looking just as surprised as I felt. But she recovered quickly, offering a polite smile and playing along as if this had been the plan all along. For the next hour, I found myself sitting with the group, trying to keep up with the conversation, while silently cursing myself for getting into this mess. Claire, to her credit, was kind. She accepted the flowers and chocolates with a gracious smile, and though she didn't say much, she didn't seem put off by the whole debacle. Eventually, she stood up to leave, and I jumped at the opportunity to escape with her. We walked out of the pub together, the cool night air a welcome relief after the suffocating tension inside. Once we were a few steps away, she turned to me, her expression a mix of amusement and pity. "So," she said, "you were really here to ask her out, weren't you?" I nodded, too embarrassed to deny it. "Yeah," I admitted, "but I guess I didn't make myself very clear." She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that eased some of the sting. "They thought you just wanted to hang out with the group," she said. "But hey, at least I got some flowers and chocolates out of it." We stood there for a moment, the awkwardness melting into something lighter. She didn't seem annoyed or uncomfortable, just amused by the absurdity of the situation. "You know," she said, her tone teasing, "I'm free tomorrow night if you want to give this whole date thing another shot." I blinked, caught off guard by her offer. She was joking. She had to be. But the smile on her face told me otherwise. "You'd really want to go out with me?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. "Why not?" she said with a shrug. "You're sweet. And you did go all out for someone you barely know. That's kind of endearing." The next night, Claire and I went on a proper date, just the two of us this time. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The dinner couldn't have ended soon enough. I was sitting across from him, poking at the last remnants of my meal, nodding along to whatever story he was droning on about. My mind had checked out 30 minutes ago, and I was already strategizing how to politely extract myself from this painfully dull evening. It wasn't that he was offensive or rude, he just wasn't anything. No spark, no charm, just one long, monotonous monologue about his job at a medical lab. When the check finally arrived, I exhaled with relief. One hurdle down. He offered to drive me home, and though my gut told me to order an Uber, I didn't want to seem rude. A car ride couldn't be worse than the dinner, right? Wrong. So wrong. The drive started quietly enough. I stared out the window, counting street lights and mentally replaying my excuses for why I couldn't go on a second date. He made small talk, something about the upcoming weekend, but I was barely listening. I just wanted to get home, peel off my heels, and binge-watch a show that didn't make me feel trapped. Then, out of nowhere, he pulled the car over. We were on a quiet, dimly lit street, far from my apartment. My stomach tightened. "Why are we stopping?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, though my pulse quickened. He turned to me, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. "I just thought, maybe we could take a moment." "A moment for what?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. Before I could react, he leaned closer, his hand gently cupping the back of my neck. It was the kind of move that might have been romantic under different circumstances, like, say, if I actually wanted him to kiss me. But I didn't. Not even close. My plan was simple. Dodge the kiss, offer a friendly hug, and tell him to take me home. Easy. But as he leaned in, my attempt to steer the interaction quickly spiraled out of control. Instead of stopping at a kiss, his hand tightened ever so slightly, and he pushed my head downward. It wasn't forceful, but it was clear. Crystal clear. He wasn't looking for a hug. and he definitely wasn't reading the signals I wasn't even trying to send. Time froze. My brain screamed, "Are you serious right now?" I pulled back, jerking my head away from his grip. "What the hell are you doing?" I said, my voice sharp. He stammered, his grin faltering, but he didn't apologize. He didn't even seem embarrassed. Instead, he shrugged, like his actions were perfectly reasonable. "I thought you might be into it," he said. "Into it? Into it?" The audacity made my blood boil, but my instincts told me to keep my cool. I needed to get out of this car, not escalate things with a man who clearly didn't respect boundaries. But then an idea struck me. A wicked, absurd, beautiful idea. If he thought he could treat me like this, I'd make him regret it. I straightened in my seat, meeting his gaze with a soft, almost bashful expression. "Listen," I began, my tone shifting to something more vulnerable, almost confessional. "Before we go any further, there's something I need to tell you." His eyebrows furrowed, but his curiosity was piqued. "What is it?" he asked, leaning back slightly. "I really like you," I said, laying it on thick. "But I need to be honest. It's only fair." He nodded slowly, his confusion morphing into cautious interest. "Okay." I took a deep breath, as if gathering my courage, and delivered the line that would haunt him forever. "I work as an escort on the side." The words hung in the air like a grenade, their weight pulling his expression from curious to horrified. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I pressed on, undeterred. "It's just to pay the bills," I explained, keeping my tone calm and matter-of-fact. "College is expensive, and this helps a lot. Plus, the money's really good, especially when clients pay extra to, skip the condoms." His face turned an alarming shade of pale. "Wait, what?" he managed to choke out. "I just think honesty is so important," I said earnestly, doubling down. "I mean, you work in a lab testing for STDs, right? You probably understand how important it is to be transparent about these things." His jaw tightened, his eyes darting nervously toward the windshield, the dashboard, anywhere but me. "Yeah." The silence stretched, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I think maybe I should take you home." His voice was shaky, the bravado from earlier completely gone. I bit back a smile, feigning disappointment. "Oh," I said softly. "I understand. I just wanted to be honest. But, if you ever change your mind—" "Nope," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I don't think that's gonna happen." I couldn't help it anymore. A laugh bubbled up in my chest, but I managed to keep it silent as he started the car and pulled back onto the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The rest of the drive was blissfully silent, his discomfort radiating off him in waves. When we finally arrived at my apartment, I opened the door and turned to him, my expression perfectly sweet. "Thanks for the ride," I said. "Have a good night." He mumbled something incoherent, refusing to meet my eyes as I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me. I walked up the steps to my building, feeling a mix of triumph and disbelief. As I shut the door to my apartment, I burst out laughing. The absurdity of the night was almost too much to process. My roommate poked her head out from the kitchen, eyebrows raised. "How was the date?" she asked. I collapsed onto the couch, grinning. "Oh, you have no idea." And then I told her everything, relishing every horrified expression, every gasp of disbelief. By the end of the story, she was in tears, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. "Did he really think that would work?" she said between giggles. "What an idiot." "Right?" I said, shaking my head. "But hey, at least I got the last word." We met on Tinder, swiping right on what seemed like the perfect connection. His name was Ryan, and from the start, our conversations were easy, the kind that flowed effortlessly late into the night. He was charming, funny, and attentive, the kind of guy who made you feel like the only person in the room, or in this case, the chat. By the time we went on our first date, I was cautiously optimistic. He was even better in person, quick with a laugh, endlessly curious, and surprisingly vulnerable for someone I'd just met. Things moved fast after that. By the second date, he was asking me to be his girlfriend. I should have seen the warning signs then. "I think we have something special," he'd said, his voice soft but insistent as we sat across from each other at a tiny cafe. "I don't want to see anyone else." "Do you?" It was sweet, in a way, but it felt rushed. I barely knew him. 2 dates weren't enough to build a foundation for something real, and I told him as much, gently but firmly. "I'm not ready for that yet," I said. "Let's see where this goes." He took it well, or so I thought. He smiled, nodded, and said he understood. And for the next month, things were great. We saw each other constantly, talked on the phone every night, and built the kind of connection that made me start to reconsider my earlier hesitation. By the time I told him I was ready to make things official, I'd convinced myself this could be something good, something lasting. I was wrong. The day after we became a couple, everything changed. My phone was eerily silent, a sharp contrast to the constant stream of texts and calls I'd grown used to. I told myself he was just busy, that maybe he needed space, but as the hours ticked by, unease settled in. When he finally texted the following day, it wasn't to reassure me or explain his absence. It was to break up with me. "I don't think this is working out," the message read. Simple. Final. No explanation, no room for discussion. Just a clean cut. I stared at the screen, disbelief and anger warring in my chest. How could he go from pleading for a relationship to ending it without so much as a phone call? It felt surreal, but I didn't beg for answers. I wasn't that kind of person. "Okay," I replied, my fingers trembling with suppressed frustration. "If that's how you feel, I'll respect it." And I meant it. For all his immaturity, I was ready to move on. But he wasn't. 2 months later, the texts started. At first, they seemed harmless enough, an occasional "hey" or "how have you been" that I could easily ignore. But his messages quickly escalated in frequency and intensity. By the end of the first week, my phone was constantly buzzing with calls and texts from him, hundreds in total. When I finally responded, it was to set a boundary. "Ryan, I need you to stop contacting me. We're done. Please respect that." He didn't. Instead, he doubled down, moving from text messages to every social media platform he could find. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, each flooded with his words, his pictures, his desperate attempts to rekindle something I didn't want. At first, I blocked him one account at a time, thinking he'd get the hint, but for every profile I blocked, another would pop up. His messages ranged from pleading to accusatory, sweet to sinister. "I miss you," he'd write in one breath. "You'll regret this," he'd say in the next. One night, I woke up to a picture of him holding an old Polaroid of the two of us from our short-lived relationship. The caption read, "We were so happy. Why did you ruin it?" The picture sent chills down my spine. We'd only dated for a month. We hadn't even taken pictures together. When had he taken that? And why had he kept it? By the time I blocked him on every platform I could think of, I thought it was finally over. For nearly a year, I heard nothing. Life moved on, and the memory of Ryan became a story I told friends with a wry laugh, a cautionary tale about the perils of dating apps. But he wasn't done. A year after it ended, he resurfaced. This time, it was through LinkedIn. LinkedIn, of all places. I stared at the connection request, the little thumbnail image of his face grinning at me like a ghost from the past. My heart raced, a mix of anger and disbelief flooding my system. I blocked him immediately, hoping it was just a one-off attempt to reconnect. Then came Google+, a platform I didn't even use anymore. And again, a friend request appeared with his name attached. It was like he'd combed through every corner of the internet, every digital thread that might still link us, determined to find a way back into my life. I blocked him there too, wondering how long this would go on. The answer came 2 years later. Just last month, I was scrolling through Snapchat when a familiar name popped up in my notifications. My stomach dropped. He'd sent me a friend request, again. 2 years had passed, and he was still trying. I didn't accept it. I didn't even bother blocking him this time. Instead, I stared at the screen, a strange mix of pity and exasperation washing over me. Ryan wasn't someone I loved or even truly knew. He was just a man who couldn't let go, who'd turned rejection into obsession. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel fear or anger. I felt free. His persistence had become noise, a distant echo of something I'd already left behind. Studying abroad felt like stepping into a new life. The air carried an electric charge of freedom, adventure, and possibility. The narrow cobblestone streets, lit by flickering lanterns, seemed to hum with stories waiting to unfold. I was young, idealistic, and determined to embrace every moment, every chance encounter, every yes that might lead to something extraordinary. That night started innocently enough. After a long dinner with classmates, I decided to walk home alone. The streets were calm but alive, occasional laughter spilled out from cafes, and the cool breeze carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine. It was a little past 9, maybe 10. I wasn't worried. I'd walked this route before, and besides, this city felt safe. I was about halfway home when I noticed him. He was lingering on the corner, near a bakery that had already closed for the night. His clothes were wrinkled, his posture a little hunched. He didn't seem threatening, just awkward, like someone unsure of whether to approach or walk away. When our eyes met, he smiled, and then he started walking toward me. "Excuse me," he said, his accent faint but unfamiliar. "Do you live here?" I hesitated but nodded. "I'm studying abroad." His face lit up. He launched into a friendly spiel about how he was new to the area, exploring, looking for connections. His words were fast, eager, as though he were trying to convince me, and maybe himself, that he was harmless. After a few minutes, he asked if I'd go on a date with him. I didn't know what to say. He wasn't attractive, that much was clear. But he'd been polite, and I was raised to believe politeness deserved a chance. Besides, I told myself, appearances aren't everything. I could have a pleasant conversation, maybe even make a new friend. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" A few days later, we met at a nearby park. The sun was setting, bathing everything in a soft golden light that made the whole scene feel like the opening act of a romance novel. For the first half hour, everything was surprisingly normal. He talked about his travels, places he'd been, people he'd met. I listened, nodding, letting the rhythm of conversation carry us. But as the evening wore on, cracks began to form. It started with his intensity. When I spoke, he leaned in too close, his eyes locked on mine with a laser-like focus that felt more intrusive than attentive. His smile lingered a beat too long, and there was a strange tension in his laugh, like he was trying to force a connection that wasn't there. When we found a patch of grass to sit on, the atmosphere grew stranger. He positioned himself directly in front of me, his body stiff and deliberate, and stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, keeping the conversation light, but it became impossible to ignore. His eyes never left mine, his expression shifting into something I can only describe as predatory. Then came the question, "Can I kiss you?" I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the abruptness of it. He hadn't touched me, hadn't even leaned in, but the question landed like a thunderclap. It was less of a request and more of a demand disguised as politeness. "I'm not comfortable with that," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. His entire demeanor shifted. The intensity in his eyes turned darker, angrier, and his mouth twisted into a sneer. "Why not?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusatory, as though my rejection were a personal attack. "I just don't want to," I said firmly, standing my ground. "We just met." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, without warning, he erupted. His voice rose, spitting venomous words faster than I could process them. "You're such a tease," he snarled. "A slut. A bitch. Girls like you are all the same." I stood up, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. "You're disgusting," I snapped, my voice trembling with anger and fear. "You need to leave me alone." But he didn't leave. Instead, he followed me as I started walking away, alternating between insults and desperate pleas. One moment, he was calling me names, his voice dripping with contempt. The next, he was apologizing, begging for forgiveness, declaring that he loved me and wanted to marry me. "I messed up," he said, his tone frantic. "But I can fix it. We can fix it. I love you. I'll take care of you." I quickened my pace, my mind racing for an escape. He didn't stop. His voice grew louder, more erratic. "I will have sex with you," he said, the conviction in his voice sending a cold wave of terror through me. That was my breaking point. I bolted. I didn't care where I was running, as long as it was away from him. My legs burned as I weaved through the park, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. When I finally slowed down, my chest heaving, I realized I was completely disoriented. The park's winding paths and unfamiliar landmarks blurred together in my mind. I spent the next hour walking in circles, taking random turns, and doubling back on my own route to make sure he wasn't following me. My paranoia was overwhelming. Every shadow, every rustling leaf felt like a threat. The thought of him finding out where I lived kept me moving, even as exhaustion set in. By the time I made it back to my dorm, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the chain. My roommate found me sitting on the floor, my back pressed against the door as if I could hold it shut with my body alone. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tinged with alarm. I told her everything, every chilling word, every frantic moment. She stared at me wide-eyed, her hand over her mouth. "You're never seeing him again," she said firmly, and I nodded, grateful for her clarity when mine felt so fractured. I was a college sophomore, still navigating the murky waters of dating, and trusting my roommate's advice a little more than I should have. She swore up and down that Daniel was a great guy. She'd known him through a few mutual friends, funny, kind, into the same obscure movies and music that I loved. "You'll hit it off," she said. "I can feel it." When he messaged me, his plan sounded sweet. He'd make me dinner, and then we'd watch a movie. Low-key, thoughtful, unpretentious. I was charmed. In a sea of ramen and cafeteria food, the idea of someone cooking for me felt almost romantic. So when he showed up outside my dorm that evening, leaning casually against his battered old sedan, I was ready to give him the benefit of the doubt. He had a shy smile and an awkward charm that immediately put me at ease. I climbed into the passenger seat, the possibilities of the night stretching before me. "What kind of dinner are you making?" I asked as we pulled out of the parking lot. "It's a surprise," he said, grinning. "But don't worry, it'll be good." That's when things started to veer into the unexpected. Instead of heading toward his apartment or a nearby grocery store, Daniel took an unfamiliar turn. I glanced out the window, watching as the campus buildings faded into a quieter, industrial part of town. The air in the car felt suddenly heavier, the romantic glow of the evening dimming. "Are we picking up groceries first?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Sort of," he said, his tone evasive but cheerful. He didn't elaborate. When the car finally slowed, I realized we weren't at a store. We were behind it. He pulled into a shadowy alley behind a large chain supermarket, the faint hum of industrial refrigerators filling the air. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting long, jagged shadows across the lot. My stomach nodded. "What are we doing here?" I asked, trying not to sound alarmed. Daniel parked the car and turned to me, his expression earnest, as if what he was about to say made perfect, undeniable sense. "I'm just going to check the dumpsters real quick," he said casually. "You can come too if you want." "It's fun." Fun. The word hung in the air like a bad joke. I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. "The dumpsters?" He nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, they throw out so much good stuff. Vegetables, bread, sometimes even sealed snacks. You wouldn't believe it." My mind raced. This wasn't just an unexpected detour. This was an entirely different planet of weird. My first instinct was to laugh, to think this had to be some kind of bizarre prank. But Daniel's expression was sincere, almost eager. He meant it. He was serious. Before I could fully process what was happening, Daniel hopped out of the car, leaving me stunned in the passenger seat. I watched in disbelief as he strolled toward the row of dumpsters, completely unbothered, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. My hands gripped the edges of the seat, my pulse quickening. I considered getting out, calling him back, demanding he take me home. But something held me there, frozen by a mix of disbelief and morbid curiosity. I couldn't look away. For the next 20 minutes, I sat in the car, watching as Daniel rummaged through the bins like a raccoon on a mission. He moved with practiced efficiency, flipping open lids, sorting through piles of discarded produce, and occasionally holding something up to inspect it in the dim light. At one point, he pulled out a loaf of bread, gave it a triumphant shake, and tossed it into a tote bag he'd brought along. My stomach churned. This was not the charming, low-key evening I'd envisioned. From time to time, he glanced back at the car, as if expecting me to join him. I stayed put, arms crossed, my discomfort growing with every passing second. The moments stretched endlessly, each one more surreal than the last. When he finally returned, he looked pleased, like a hunter returning from a successful expedition. He placed the tote bag in the back seat with a satisfied sigh, brushing stray bits of lettuce off his jacket. "Well," he said, sliding into the driver's seat. "That went pretty well." I stared at him, struggling to find words. "You're serious about this?" "Why not?" he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's sustainable. And free. Waste not, want not, right?" I wanted to argue, to tell him how absurd this all was, but I was too stunned to form a coherent response. Instead, I settled on the only thing I could manage. "Can you just take me back to my dorm?" His face fell slightly, but he nodded. "Sure. But are you sure you don't want to stay for dinner? I think I can make something great with this haul." I didn't answer. I just stared out the window, silently willing the drive to go faster. The ride back was quiet. Daniel made a few attempts at small talk, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. My mind was too busy replaying the bizarre events of the evening, trying to reconcile the sweet, awkward guy who'd picked me up with the dumpster diving enthusiast who now sat beside me. When we finally pulled up outside my dorm, I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to him, trying to find something polite to say. "Thanks for the ride," I muttered. "Good luck with dinner." He smiled, seemingly unbothered by my obvious discomfort. "Thanks. And hey, maybe we can try again sometime. I promise I'll make it up to you." I nodded vaguely, not wanting to prolong the conversation. Then I got out of the car and walked quickly toward the entrance, my heart still racing. We'd matched a week earlier. His name was Ryan. Clean-cut, quick-witted, and charming in a way that seemed effortless. He had a smile that could disarm you and an easy confidence that made you want to trust him. Maybe that was the problem. The date itself was fine, dinner at a small Italian restaurant. He was attentive, asked all the right questions, and kept the conversation light and engaging. If there were any red flags, I missed them entirely. By the time he offered to drive me home, I felt relaxed. Safe. I should have known better. It started with a rolling stop. We'd barely made it 2 blocks when he slid through a stop sign without even pretending to slow down. My brow furrowed, but I didn't say anything. Maybe he didn't see it. Maybe it was just an honest mistake. But then, a few minutes later, he took a left turn where a large, glaring sign clearly read "No left turn." My unease deepened as I glanced at him. Ryan," I said hesitantly. "I think that was illegal." He chuckled, brushing it off like it was no big deal. "It's fine. Nobody's out here this late." As if on cue, flashing red and blue lights lit up the rearview mirror, accompanied by the wail of a siren. My stomach dropped. He cursed under his breath, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. "Pull over," I said, my voice a mix of urgency and disbelief. He didn't. Instead, he muttered, "I can't do this right now," and slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, pinning me against the seat as we sped down the empty street. My heart was in my throat, panic clawing at my chest. "What are you doing?" I shouted, gripping the door handle as if it might somehow save me. "I just need to lose them," he said, his voice steady in a way that terrified me even more. "It'll be fine. Trust me." Trust him? Trust him? The man who'd just turned a routine traffic stop into a car chase? My head spun as I tried to process what was happening. The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights brighter, as the police car closed in behind us. "Ryan, this is insane. Stop the car," I begged, but he was too focused on the road, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the wheel. He made a sharp turn onto a residential street, the tires screeching beneath us. Houses blurred past as he scanned for somewhere to hide. Finally, he veered into a random driveway, killing the engine and plunging us into silence. "Stay quiet," he whispered, as if this were some kind of spy movie and not a life-altering disaster unfolding in real time. I sat frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears, as the police car slowed at the end of the street. For a brief, agonizing moment, I thought they might pass us by. But then the car stopped. The lights cut off, and the officers got out. The next few minutes were a chaotic blur. The police approached the car with weapons drawn, shouting commands I could barely process through the fog of panic. "Hands where we can see them. Both of you, out of the vehicle, now." My hands trembled as I fumbled with the seatbelt, my mind racing. I wasn't even sure if I could stand. My legs felt like jelly. Ryan stepped out first, his movements slow and deliberate, as if this was all just a minor inconvenience. "It's not what it looks like," he said calmly, raising his hands. But it was exactly what it looked like. And worse. I followed him out, my hands shaking as I lifted them above my head. The officers moved quickly, barking orders, their flashlights blinding in the darkness. Before I knew it, I was in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into my wrists. "Wait!" I stammered, my voice cracking. "I didn't do anything. I don't even know what's going on." The officers weren't interested in my protests. They marched us to the curb, sat us down, and began searching the car. Ryan was eerily quiet, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, my mind raced with questions and fears. How had this gone so wrong? Who was this man? And why, in the name of all that was sane, had I agreed to get in his car? It didn't take long for the truth to come out. One of the officers emerged from the car, holding a radio in one hand and a file in the other. His expression was grim. "This car's stolen," he announced, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. My stomach dropped. I stared at Ryan, horrified, but he didn't even flinch. "And he's got outstanding warrants," the officer continued, glancing down at the file. "We'll need to extradite him." I could barely breathe. Stolen car? Warrants? What kind of person had I just spent the evening with? The officers pulled Ryan to his feet, reading him his rights as they led him to the patrol car. He didn't look back. Not once. As for me, they removed the handcuffs but didn't let me go. Not right away. They asked me questions, how I knew him, what I knew about the car, whether I was involved in any of his crimes. I answered as best I could, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. Eventually they believed me. They offered me a ride home, and though the thought of getting into another car, any car, made my skin crawl, I didn't have much choice. The ride was silent, except for the officer driving. "You're lucky," he said after a long pause. "Guys like that, they don't usually stop at traffic violations. Could have been worse." I nodded numbly, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Lucky? I didn't feel lucky. I felt shaken, exposed, and deeply, profoundly stupid. How had I missed the signs? Or were there even signs to miss? When we finally pulled up to my apartment, I thanked the officer quietly and slipped inside. The moment the door closed behind me, I sank to the floor, my entire body trembling. I never saw Ryan again. From what the police told me, he was extradited to another state the following week. His outstanding warrants included everything from grand theft auto to fraud. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that drive, about the look on his face as the sirens closed in, about the calm way he'd said, "Trust me," as if trust could ever survive something like that. And I think about how close I came to becoming a footnote in his story, another casualty of his recklessness. It was a lesson I wouldn't forget. Sometimes, danger doesn't come with warning signs. Sometimes, it comes with a charming smile and an offer to drive you home. The night began with such promise. It was a quaint little restaurant, the kind with dim lighting, warm wooden accents, and a soft hum of classical music in the background. The kind of place where you'd imagine love stories beginning over candlelight. That's what I was hoping for, at least a story worth telling. When he walked in, I thought maybe I'd found it. He was handsome in a boyish way, rumpled dark hair, a slightly crooked smile, and a nervous energy that felt endearing rather than off-putting. Let's call him Daniel. He greeted me with a genuine warmth that immediately put me at ease, and as we settled into our table, the conversation flowed naturally. No awkward pauses, no rehearsed lines. Just two strangers learning about each other over shared glances and laughter. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. Then, the waiter came to take our order. I'd barely scanned the menu before deciding on the chicken Alfredo. Simple, safe, and reliably delicious. Daniel followed my lead, ordering the steak medium rare. Nothing unusual. The waiter smiled, jotted down our choices, and disappeared into the flow of the busy dining room. That's when Daniel's demeanor shifted. It was subtle at first. He became quieter, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for something, or someone. I asked him if everything was okay, and he offered a tight-lipped smile, assuring me it was. But his gaze never quite landed on mine. "I'll be right back," he said abruptly, pushing his chair back. "Just need to step out for a second." I nodded, confused but polite. Maybe he needed the restroom. Maybe he was just nervous and needed a moment to gather himself. I sipped my water, glancing around at the other couples and groups of friends enjoying their meals. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I checked my phone. Nothing. By the time 15 minutes rolled around, I was ready to leave. I'd been ghosted before, but never this dramatically. I started calculating how much cash I had in my purse, wondering if I should pay for both our meals out of sheer embarrassment, when the door to the restaurant swung open. There he was. At first glance, Daniel looked off. His eyes were red and glassy, and his steps were slow, like he was dragging himself back to the table. My immediate thought was that he'd gone outside to smoke. A quick puff to calm his nerves, maybe. I hated smoking, always had, so right then and there, I knew the rest of the date was pointless. A deal breaker is a deal breaker. But then, as he sat down across from me, I noticed something else. His hands were trembling. His breathing was uneven, like he'd just run a marathon. Before I could ask what had happened, he looked at me with an apologetic expression so raw, so vulnerable, that I felt my annoyance falter. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to disappear like that. It's just," he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "You ordered the chicken Alfredo." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "What?" He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "My ex always ordered the chicken Alfredo. Every time we went out. It was her favorite. And when you said it, it hit me. I wasn't expecting it. I had to step outside." The words hung in the air between us, surreal and disorienting. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to piece together what he was telling me. You left because I ordered chicken Alfredo. I asked, my voice cautious, disbelieving. He nodded, his eyes glistening with something I could only describe as heartbreak. I tried to stay, he said, his voice cracking. But I couldn't. I went in my car, and I cried. He cried. In his car. Over chicken Alfredo. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh, to shake him and tell him how absurd this all was. Another part wanted to reach across the table and offer him some kind of comfort. But mostly I just felt trapped. Trapped in this moment, in this story that wasn't mine but was now uncomfortably tied to me. Daniel, I began carefully, I'm really sorry that you're still hurting over your ex. But maybe you're not ready to be dating. He flinched like the word stung, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he let out a hollow laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. I thought I was, he admitted. I really did. But when you said those words, it was like she was here. Like I could hear her voice again, see her sitting there across from me. I nodded slowly, my discomfort growing with every passing second. I didn't know this man. I didn't know his ex. But suddenly, I was a ghost in his memory, a stand-in for something he couldn't let go of. The rest of the evening limped forward like a wounded animal. Our meals arrived, and while the chicken Alfredo was as delicious as ever, it was hard to enjoy it under the weight of Daniel's sorrow. He picked at his steak, barely eating, offering apologies between long silences. I tried to keep the conversation light, steering it away from his ex and the overwhelming shadow she'd cast over our date, but it was like trying to fill a sinking ship with a bucket. The night was irreparably ruined. By the time the check arrived, I was counting the seconds until I could leave. Daniel offered to pay, but I insisted we split it. I didn't want to owe him anything, not a cent, not a memory, nothing. As we stood outside the restaurant, the chill of the night air biting at my skin, he looked at me with that same wounded expression. I really am sorry, he said. You didn't deserve that. I forced a polite smile, already taking a step back. It's okay. Take care of yourself, Daniel. He nodded, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and walked away into the night. I watched him go, a strange mix of pity and relief swirling in my chest. When I first matched with her on the app, it felt promising. Let's call her Emily. She had this bright, disarming smile in her pictures, one that felt both genuine and intriguing. Our initial conversation was effortless, filled with humor and just the right amount of flirtation. It was rare to find that kind of spark online, but sparks can be misleading. By the end of our first evening texting, I felt hopeful. Emily was sharp, funny, and seemed down to earth. We traded banter, talked about favorite movies, and even shared playlists. For once, it felt like this wasn't going to be another dead-end match. I was wrong. On day 3, her messages began to shift. It wasn't gradual. It was like turning a page in a book and realizing you're suddenly in a completely different story. Out of nowhere, Emily started sharing deeply personal details about her life. She talked about therapy sessions, past betrayals, and family issues, painting a picture of someone who had clearly been through a lot. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't mind that she'd opened up. Vulnerability isn't a bad thing, but this felt abrupt, almost out of context. Just 2 days earlier, we'd been laughing about bad karaoke experiences, and now we were diving headfirst into her emotional scars. It was jarring. I listened as best I could, sending supportive responses, though I didn't feel we'd earned that level of intimacy yet. Trust takes time, and I wasn't ready to carry someone else's weight, not when I barely knew them. Still, I figured it was just a moment. She'd recalibrate, right? I hoped. By day 5, the universe had other plans for me. That morning, I saw something my ex posted online. It wasn't anything dramatic, a photo, a casual caption, but it hit me harder than I cared to admit. Grief isn't linear, and heartbreak doesn't keep to a schedule. It gutted me. Suddenly, every ounce of energy I had drained out of me. I wasn't angry or bitter, just hollow. I wasn't ready to talk to anyone that day, least of all Emily, someone I barely knew. When her text popped up mid-morning, cheerfully asking how my day was going, I stared at my phone for a moment before replying. I needed space, I told her. I explained it kindly, honestly, or at least I thought I had. I figured she'd understand. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No reply. I assumed she'd taken it in stride. I set my phone down, crawled into bed, and let the world slip away for a little while. When I picked up my phone a few hours later, everything had changed. From missed calls, 9 unread texts, My stomach sank as I scrolled through the notifications, each one heavier than the last. The texts weren't the light-hearted kind, the hope you're okay messages a friend might send. No, these were diatribes, paragraphs filled with frustration, accusation, and melodrama. "This always happens to me," she wrote. "Every time I open up to someone, they push me away. I thought you were different." The words felt less like a plea for understanding and more like a hammer of guilt, wielded with precision. I was apparently revealing my true colors. Her tone was relentless, painting herself as the victim of yet another failed connection, and me as the perpetrator of some imagined cruelty. I didn't know how to respond, or if I even wanted to. I barely knew this woman, yet she was demanding an explanation, an apology, as if I owed her something. I didn't. Not after 5 days of texting. Not after what was, at best, a passing connection. I let the messages sit there, unanswered. The next morning, I sent her one final text. I kept it brief and polite, though every word felt like walking a tightrope. I told her this wasn't going to work out, and wished her the best. Then, without waiting for a response, I blocked her number. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. Blocking someone felt extreme, but Emily had shown her hand. Her reaction wasn't just intense, it was a red flag the size of a billboard. I realized I wasn't ready to date anyway. Maybe it was a blessing in disguise, a favor she'd unwittingly done for me by showing me what I wasn't ready to handle. For weeks, I thought about her only in passing. Occasionally, I'd remember her words and feel a pang of discomfort, but mostly I moved on. My focus shifted inward, time spent healing, reflecting, rediscovering what I wanted and needed. Slowly, I felt like myself again. And then last night, she found me. I was scrolling through Facebook, mindlessly liking photos of old classmates and distant cousins, when the notification popped up. A friend request from her. My heart skipped a beat. Emily. Her profile picture was unmistakable, that same bright, disarming smile. But how? I had never given her my last name. We hadn't exchanged social media handles, or even mentioned mutual friends. Yet there she was, finding me in the vast, endless expanse of the internet. It was unsettling, to say the least. For a moment, I stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. My thumb hovered over the delete request button, but curiosity nagged at me. How had she tracked me down? Was this some kind of coincidence, or had she gone digging for information? I clicked her profile, scrolling through her posts and photos. It was a strange feeling, seeing someone's curated life after you'd glimpsed the raw, unfiltered version of them. Her timeline was cheerful, polished, filled with inspirational quotes and selfies. If you didn't know better, you'd think she was just another happy, well-adjusted person. But I knew better. I deleted the request without hesitation. Whatever Emily was looking for, it wasn't something I could give her. Whether she was seeking closure or rekindling whatever connection she thought we'd had, I wanted no part of it. That chapter of my life, brief, chaotic, and bewildering as it was, needed to stay closed. As I sat there, staring at the empty notification tab, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, mostly, but also a lingering unease. Emily had been a lesson, one I hadn't expected but desperately needed. Trust takes time, and not every spark is worth chasing. I powered down my phone, set it aside, and took a deep breath. The world felt quieter, safer without her presence looming in my digital periphery. It was over now, for good this time. Or at least, I hoped it was. I matched with her on Tinder a week ago. Julia. She was the kind of girl who'd turn heads back in high school. A magnetic smile. Wild laughter that made you feel like you were the only one in on the joke. We'd never spoken much back then, but when her profile popped up, I couldn't swipe right fast enough. Her message came almost immediately. Dinner at my place next Friday? I make a killer lasagna. I wasn't one to turn down a home-cooked meal, especially not when it came with the possibility of rekindling some teenage fantasies. So there I was, pulling up to her place, an unassuming house in a quiet suburb, armed with a bottle of cheap wine and a half-decent button-up shirt. Butterflies swirled in my stomach as I knocked on the door. When she opened it, she looked even better than her pictures. Casual but alluring, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, lips painted crimson. "Glad you made it," she said, her voice warm, inviting. "Come in." The smell of lasagna wafted through the air, mingling with the subtle vanilla scent of her perfume. I stepped into her living room, my eyes darting around. Cozy, clean, filled with personal touches, framed photos, mismatched throw pillows. Then I saw the kid, a tiny human parked on the couch, watching cartoons, completely unfazed by my presence. "Oh, this is Benji," Julia said with a shrug, as if she'd forgotten to mention the small fact of her motherhood. "He's 7. Cool with kids." I stammered out something vaguely agreeable. Kids were fine, I told myself. In small doses. Dinner was surprisingly good. Julia was charming, witty, every bit the girl I'd fantasized about back in school. Benji piped in occasionally, asking questions about my car or whether I could do a backflip. The whole scene was strangely domestic, but there was an energy between Julia and me, an unspoken tension crackling just beneath the surface. As the night wore on and Benji was shuffled off to bed, Julia's demeanor shifted. Her smile lingered longer, her touches grew bolder. "Want to head upstairs?" she asked, her voice a low purr. I followed her without hesitation. Her bedroom was dimly lit, the faint glow of candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. I barely had time to take it in before she was pulling me close, her lips on mine, hands exploring. The world outside faded, reduced to nothing but the heat between us. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound. A faint, unmistakable noise that sliced through the moment like a knife. The slam of a car door. Julia froze. Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "Shit," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. "He's home." I blinked, my brain sluggish to catch up. "Who's home?" "My husband," she hissed, grabbing at her clothes. "You have to go." "Husband?" The word hit me like a bucket of ice water. Adrenaline surged as I realized the gravity of the situation. "What the hell, Julia?" I whispered harshly, fumbling for my jeans. They were nowhere to be found. "Just get out," she urged, shoving my shirt into my hands. "Window go." I glanced at the window. 2 stories up, a sheer drop onto what looked like a rosebush-covered lawn. "You can't be serious." Footsteps echoed from downstairs, heavy, deliberate. Julia's panic was contagious now, coursing through me like an electric shock. There wasn't time to argue. Heart pounding, I pushed open the window, cold air hitting my skin like a slap. "Go," she hissed again, shoving me toward the ledge. I swung one leg over, then the other, muttering a stream of curses under my breath. Below me, the yard stretched out like a dark abyss. I had no plan, no dignity, and absolutely no time. I jumped. The landing was less than graceful. Thorns tore at my bare legs as I tumbled into the bushes, biting back a scream. Pain radiated from my shoulder, but there was no time to assess the damage. Somewhere inside, I could hear voices, Julia's husband, confused, demanding answers. "Thought you said you were working late," I heard her say, her voice strained but steady. A masterclass in damage control. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline dulling the pain. Barefoot, shirtless, and in nothing but my boxers, I bolted across the yard. The cold ground stung my feet as I sprinted for the safety of my car, parked a block away. Behind me, a light flicked on. I didn't look back to see if anyone was watching. I didn't want to know. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, lungs burning, heart hammering like a drum. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, glancing around to make sure no one had followed me. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, suffocating. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My shoulder throbbed, and I noticed for the first time that my boxers were shredded, tiny red scratches crisscrossing my thighs. What the hell is wrong with people? I muttered to no one. The absurdity of it all hit me then. The lasagna, the kid, the husband, the damn rosebush. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest, spilling out before I could stop it. I was half naked, bruised, and bleeding in the middle of suburbia, and all I could do was laugh. The drive home was a blur. By the time I stumbled into my apartment, the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a dull ache and a bone-deep exhaustion. I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night over and over in my head. The audacity of it, the betrayal, the sheer, chaotic absurdity. Part of me wanted to text Julia, demand answers, call her out on her lies. But what would be the point? She wasn't the girl I thought she was, and I sure as hell wasn't about to be her collateral damage. I dodged a bullet tonight, barely. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made a silent vow. No more Tinder, no more lasagna, and absolutely no more married women.